Welcome everybody to this second workshop in our workshop series on common challenges in citizen science. My name is Michael Creek from Stikidot in Brussels in Belgium. It's really a pleasure to welcome you all back again. For what promises to be a really meaty workshop on a very challenging topic that I think we've all come up against. Just a reminder about the series itself. So the series is hosted by CIVIL, which is Flanders Knowledge Centre on Citizen Science. So CIVIL's role is to promote citizen science, bringing people together, and also supporting and advising on projects on citizen science. And so as part of all three of those roles, we've been working together. So Stikidot working with CIVIL on workshops looking at challenges in citizen science. We've run them for a couple of years now. And this year we decided to go into more depth to separate out our challenges into starting with citizen science that we looked at together last week at a really nice workshop. Today, of course, the focus is on data, but next week we'll be looking at communication challenges. And in our final session, just before Christmas, we'll be looking at how to obtain institutional buy-in on the long term for citizen science, making sure it's not just one-off, that it becomes part of our organization's culture. So we've got plenty of challenges ahead, and we're going to be getting through a lot today. We're excited to be working on that together. So as I say, I'm from Stikidot in Brussels. You'll see also Marcia on the call, one of the other co-founders. So we're a collective working in co-creation on science and society in a whole range of projects. Very happy to be working together with CIVIL on this. So today, again, we're looking to get to know each other a little better and hear about each other's experiences, but also take some inspiration from good practices that we've identified. So we'll be starting it off again with some inspirational presentations, but then we'll be putting our heads together to look at the common barriers that we face on data and what we can do about them as a community. So the structure is very much like last week with our bit of a warm-up, some opening presentations. We'll do a brainstorm on the common challenges. We'll, as usual, enforce our 5-minute break halfway through. And then the second half of the workshop will be the breakouts, the discussion, and we'll come back together to hear about what's been going on before we close at 5. So a little reminder of our tech tips, just for anyone who's not so used to, who's normally stuck on Teams and not Zoom. You can rename yourself with your name and organization if you click on the participants menu. Have a look in the chat to see what's going on, and don't hesitate to share your video during the workshop, and remember to unmute yourself when you want to speak. So make sure your phones are on silent. Hope you've got a cup of something or a glass of water on hand, maybe something to take notes. And we'll start with a short warm-up. Again. And it's my pleasure to introduce Pen Nguyen Singh. So our guest speaker for the day, Pen is a research associate at the University of Bath in the UK. So after years and years of experience in field research, ecological research across the planet, Pen has lots of experience as well in science outreach, is very passionate about data, open data in particular, data science. We're going to be hearing about the project Mammal Web, among others. I will hand over to you, Pen. Thank you very much for joining us today. Really looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I really feel quite honored to be with all of you today. So I've been involved in different aspects of open science for a while, and I know that today's focus is on data, but I like to zoom out a little bit, maybe, and kind of put data into the wider context of doing open science. And since time is limited, I'll probably just, point out some of the things that I think are important in open science, and maybe that can help, stimulate some discussion on, any particular topic that people want to dive into afterwards. So my personal journey into this topic started with the citizen science project called MemoWeb, which I started several years ago in England. And it's for wildlife monitoring using a tool called camera traps. So our citizen scientists, they would set up these cameras to get really cool pictures of local wildlife in their communities. And I'm really pleased that this project has grown over the past 6 years into a network of more than 200 dedicated citizen scientists across 5 European countries. And by now, more than 2 million photos of wildlife have been uploaded to our web platform. And I'm happy that the project is doing pretty well. But what I want to talk about today is that throughout this experience, I've gained a lot of exposure to a lot of grassroots citizen science efforts that have done open science really well, right? And that's what I want to focus on today. So when it comes to the topic of open science, I was able to recently distill some of my learnings into a short course on open science, but specifically for citizen science practitioners on the EU Citizen Science Platform that was just launched last month. And I think my talk today will be structured similarly to that course, but just in a really condensed, 15-minute form, right? And to do that, I will start on the topic of open science and then try to relate that to why it's important for citizen science. And a very core question is, what is open science exactly? Well, this is actually a really tricky question, because if you ask 10 people what open science means, you will probably get 10 different answers. But luckily, I've had the privilege of working with the Global Citizen Science Partnership, which worked with the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization on the UNESCO recommendation for open science. And for those of you on the EXO mailing list, you probably saw that this recommendation was just ratified last month. And inside this recommendation, there is a definition for open science, which calls it a set of practices for reproducibility, transparency, sharing, and collaboration, resulting from the increased opening of scientific contents, tools, and processes. This is a really big mouthful, but I think to sum this up, it really just gets to what I consider to be 4 fundamental freedoms, which are the freedoms for anyone to access a scientific output so that they have the freedom to use, study, modify, and share what they've made with any other person for any purpose. Now, I think these 4 freedoms are really critical for open science, because if you think about it on a more practical level, open science allows us to do really rapid innovation, because we can very easily build on what other people have made to address really urgent global issues, right? For instance, when you think about climate change, we don't have time to wait. So open science allows us to innovate really rapidly. In other words, we don't have time to be alchemists. Now, you might be wondering why I mentioned alchemists here, and that leads to what I think is a more fundamental reason and motivation for doing open science. So this distinction is first brought up by an author called Cory Doctorow. So the idea is that when you think about alchemists, they appeared to have done research and experiments too, right? But the thing with alchemists is that they kept what they knew a secret for the past 500 years. They didn't share, and they didn't learn from each other. And because of that, they didn't advance their art very much. In fact, each of them had to learn in the hardest possible way that drinking mercury was a bad idea, right? So my takeaway from this distinction is that what sets science apart is that science is fundamentally an iterative process where we are always building on what came before. And when we do science, we have a fundamental responsibility to that iterative process. So doing good science, we're actually doing open science. if we are sharing and constantly building on which each of us has done, including all of the mistakes. And I think that's what sets science apart and what makes doing good science so important. Now, when it comes to open science outputs, if you ask a professional scientist, probably some of the first things that come to mind are sharing data, right, which we will talk about today, or publishing papers. And those things are, of course, very fundamental to doing good science. But as people who have experience with citizen science, you probably know that when it comes to scientific outputs, it's much more than sharing data and papers. For instance, in the science that we do today, we produce a lot of software in a kind of code that we write for analysis or for citizen science. And I've been very, very lucky to work with the British Ecological Society to edit a guide to reproducible code that is a good introduction to this topic. On the other hand, hardware is also something that comes from doing science and citizen science. One example is the DIY biology movement, right? So a really simple example from that is the community microscope kit from Public Lab, where citizen scientists designed and built their own microscopes as instruments to study nature. So if you're interested in the hardware side of things, I am a council member for the Gathering for Open Science Hardware. And this is a global community of scientists, citizen scientists, and other enthusiasts to look at how we can work together to advance open science hardware for scientific research. But like I said, open science is about all outputs from doing science. So I think it's important for us to think about what other outputs there are throughout the whole scientific life cycle, right? That could include, outreach and educational material from your projects, right? Or maybe even your website or your blog posts, and the list goes on. So what I try to do is to always think about what I've been doing with my citizen science project that could be shared as open science. But the other important thing is where do you actually publish this stuff? Because just publishing something on your website, that's great. But for long-term archiving, there are places dedicated to that, such as the Wikimedia Commons, the Internet Archive, or for scientific research, there's Zenodo or the Open Science Framework, also known as OSF. I think some of you might have heard of some of these platforms, and they are great places for you to share your work because they're meant for archiving your outputs for the long term. Now, another thing that we talk about in our short course for citizen scientists is a set of legal best practices or do's and don'ts from even before your project starts. This is actually very important because a lot of people don't realize that sharing and reuse are illegal by default because of copyright law. And that means that whenever you want to use something, you always need to seek explicit permission for every single time you do something. And in my opinion, this is actually really unfortunate because the way copyright law works is that it has a chilling effect that actually adds a lot of friction to sharing and reuse. I think this situation is really unfortunate, but that is the reality that we live in. So before this changes, how do we address this problem, right? So one organization I've worked with is a nonprofit called the Creative Commons. It is an international nonprofit organization now. And one of their most important contributions is a set of 6 Creative Commons licenses that come with different sets of permissions to make sharing and reusing easier. Now, 2 of those licenses are compatible with the open science freedoms that I just talked about. One is the Creative Commons Attribution License, which means that anyone is allowed to use a particular published work as long as they provide attribution to you. Or the Attribution Share Alike license, which is the same thing, except that when other people use your work, they have to continue to share it under the same terms. Now, this kind of things can get a little complicated, and I don't have time to get into that right now. But the point is that whenever you publish something as open science, remember to attach one of these two licenses to it so that the permission to reuse them are attached with the works so that other people don't have to talk to you every single time. And that makes open science so much easier. Now, I've talked about output so far, but what citizen science has done really well is actually pioneering a lot of open science processes to make doing science more inclusive and collaborative, right? So for contributory projects, some people have done it really well, like the Zooniverse or Sapelli, right? They've done amazing work. But what I'm particularly inspired by are co-created citizen science projects that were started by the grassroots. For instance, I really love the SafeCast project that was started in Japan after the Fukushima nuclear disaster just over a decade ago, right? So concerned citizens at the time, they didn't have a lot of access to information. So they designed and built their own open source hardware radiation sensors to map the distribution of harmful radiation in their communities. And this became so successful that SafeCast has grown into a global network of citizen scientists doing environmental monitoring. The other project I always talk about is Public Lab. And this started also just over a decade ago after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And this was also started by concerned citizens. And they built their own aerial sensing platforms to map the spread of the oil spill. And this success has actually led to Public Lab becoming a global network of different citizen science projects, one of which that I also talk about is one where they captured photographic evidence of a private company that's dumping toxic waste into a river. And they were able to use this photographic evidence in legal proceedings against that company to seek reparations and damages. And the reason I talk about these really successful examples is that these grassroots citizen science projects, they have really pioneered open science processes where they made the entire scientific process more inclusive, where everyone can get involved at every step of the way. So the question is then, why is open science so important for citizen science? Well, on one hand, citizen science has pioneered a lot of the processes, but the other part is that it really complements open science because open science practitioners have established a lot of really good and best practices on how to do the sharing and reuse side of things, such as certain standards that you should adhere to, or using the licenses that I just talked about to ensure those open science freedoms. But I think a second reason that open science is so important for citizen science is because for a lot of citizen scientists, they are experiencing doing science for the first time. And I think it is crucial for that first experience to come with an understanding of why open science is so important. So to quickly sum it up, I think open science is crucial because it is responsible science. It applies to the whole research life cycle, and we can think really creatively about how you want to apply that. And it complements citizen science really well. So these are some of my takeaways and just a sample of some of my initial reflections that are captured in our short course on the EU Citizen Science Platform. Or if you're really interested in open science and how to think about the data side of things, there's the Open Science MOOC that is really comprehensive, that really digs into this. And all of those things are just amazing resources for us to dig into. So I hope this very brief kind of high-level overview can serve as a good stimulation for our discussions today. And I really look forward to learning from all of you. And thank you so much for having me today.
A real pleasure. Thank you so much, Ben, for this brilliantly presented overview of why it's so important. And I love this point about the fact that it is, yeah, as you say, it's people's first contact often with a real research process. And so we have a responsibility ourselves to be presenting it in a way that makes it clear what open science is all about, why it's so important. Yeah, it's really brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm sure there are plenty of questions, and please don't hesitate to keep the questions coming in the chat, because we'll have a moment after the next presentation to get into a bit of conversation. But until then, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. So Annelies Duerings, you probably know her all very well already, and certainly if you were here last week. Annelies is the coordinator of CIVIL, the Flemish Knowledge Centre on Citizen Science. And we're going to be hearing a bit about CIVIL's data charter. So over to you, Annelies.
Okay, I will try to share my screen with you. So you can see the slides?
Not yet.
Yeah, probably now.
There we go. Yeah.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see some of you back after last week and to see some new faces as well. I will very briefly present to you our data charter for citizen science. We actually launched this in April of this year already in Dutch. Now, since today, it is also available in English from our website. You can go there and download it. It's a guide on how to deal with all data-related aspects in citizen science. We created it because we got so many questions about this topic in the beginning, and to be honest, I didn't know myself either where to start. So it's a guide really for beginners when you know nothing about the topic and you're running a citizen science project and you're gathering data. You can find here where to start and which principles ideally you should adhere to. It was created by our working group on data. So lots of people participated to create this document. And especially I want to mention Mieke Sterken and Ruben Capio, who throughout 2 years really organized the whole process. Okay. What did the process look like? First, the working group started with a group of existing principles. They are the FAIR data principles, the 10 citizen science principles from EXA. There also is an open data charter in Flanders. It's focused on local governments mainly and on regional governments with lots of very interesting, useful principles in it. But we felt it wasn't really suitable for citizen science. So our first idea was maybe we could just give the existing data charter to the projects because something exists already, but there really was a mismatch with what citizen science projects needed. And well, from there, we got our idea to create really a citizen science data charter. We put all these principles in a big mural board, and then we started mapping them or rearranging them according to thematics, ethics, licenses, metadata, data standards. We checked how they were applicable to citizen science. Some were reformulated, merged together, or split up. Some principles were added. And then when we had 26 final principles, information was added on how to deal with these principles. How do you do that? What is a data standard? Where do you find such things? And how do you fix that your data is suitable for such a data standard? So we added all kind of information to the mix, and that's actually what our data charter then has become. There are 5 main topics in the document. So it starts with an open attitude, everything on open data, open source, open publications, to make everything that you do in your citizen science project as open as possible and as close as necessary. Then there's a chapter on privacy and ethics and all the issues related to that to make sure that what you do in your project is also ethical. There's then a topic on data hygiene to make your data qualitative. For example, it says you should work with a data model, know beforehand what kind of data will you be collecting, how should it look like. There's a chapter on data standards to make it easier to link your data to other data that's already existing. And then finally, a chapter on metadata to document your data, to make it findable, reusable. So each of these topics has approximately 5 principles in it. And these are just some examples of what it really looks like. For example, the second principle on open data is publish your data under an open license. And you can choose from a short recommended list. First, we explain what are licenses, when do you use them, where can you find them. We, for example, also included a flow chart where you start at the beginning and then you have to answer some questions on how open do you want your data to be, and then you get a Creative Commons license recommended that suits your project. There are tips and tricks in the document. For example, be aware if you use an existing platform to capture your data that the platform probably already has a license, and go check what the license is and see if it suits your project. And then also for every principle, we try to mention a practical example, a citizen science project, usually from Flanders, that has a license in this case, and which license it is and why they chose this license, so that you can really see how other citizen science projects dealt with this principle. And this we try to do for all the 26 principles. So it's a big document full of information on how to get started with everything related to data. And since it was there was so much interest also from non-Dutch speaking people, we decided to translate it to English so that you can all enjoy our work. So that's briefly what I wanted to say about it. It's a bit of a working document. It's a snapshot for Flanders. Our main focus group, target audience, was Flanders, so it's a bit focused on how it is here, but I think the principles are more generally applicable also in other countries. And this is a first version. Depending on how much time we can keep on spending on these data issues, we hope to maybe next year or in 2 years bring out an updated version with, I heard Ben mention so many initiatives that are not yet in this guide. So I hope to one day publish an updated version with more information in it even. So voilà, thank you that I could present this today, and I hope you all enjoy the content of it.
Nice. Thank you so much, Annelies. Yeah, I was going to say, between you and Pen, you basically have covered all the resources on citizen science data I think that could possibly be out there. Yeah, thank you very much for this. And let's bring you both back into the conversation. I encourage everyone to click the view option and switch to gallery view so that we see everyone's faces, and feel free to put your videos on as well if you're ready to join in the conversation. If you do have any questions, don't hesitate to jump in, raise a hand. I also have questions, but I'm very open to leaving the floor to you as participants. And I wonder, maybe Pen or Anna, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Well, we haven't still launched a citizen science project as part of our, Eugenia and myself, we are involved in the same European project, and we are about to launch a citizen science project. And I think we haven't really thought about it. So, well, we haven't. And I'm a bit lost. So where should we start? I mean, should we start thinking about which kind of data we are going to collect, or should we start already with choosing which license we should apply for or get, or I don't know what's the correct word, but yeah, if okay, you can.
What's the starting point when it comes to data? Yeah, Pen, do you want to take this one first?
Sure. So sounds like you are just at the beginning of your project, and that's the perfect place to be, I think, because so many of these things should be thought about right from the beginning, such as the licenses you mentioned, which one you're going to use for your data, right? Having a data management plan, you know, what kinds of data you're going to collect, what are you going to share? How are you going to share it? Where are you going to share it, right? And which license to use for all of that? All of these are questions for the very beginning. So you're in the perfect place, which is a much better place than a lot of other projects, because I know from experience, if you want to do this retroactively, it's a huge pain. And part of the pain is because for more inclusive citizen science, obviously all of the participants should be involved as well. Now, I have to admit, I haven't looked at the guide from Annelies yet, but another really important resource, and I can put a link to this in the chat, is the Data Ethics Toolkit published by the Citizen Science Association in the US. So I bring that up because they have a specific part that talks about getting everyone on board and to be happy with this data arrangement from the beginning. And they actually have a guide, with a decision tree and all that on how to think about this. It is literally about to be published on the CSA website. So I'll put a link there. And if you go there in the next few weeks, or maybe the next month or so, you should be able to see the whole thing. So that gives a very comprehensive answer to your question.
So really including all stakeholders right from the beginning, including complex questions of data.
Yeah, including the citizen scientists.
Yeah. Annelies, any thoughts on this before we go to Yevgenia's question?
Yeah, I agree with Ben. It's really good that you think about it at the start of your project. It's so much easier to do it then. But still, it's a lot of different things to think about. In our data charter, well, we have 26 principles. It's a lot of work if you have to really deal with all of it. Start with the beginning. Don't be overwhelmed. Don't be discouraged. Just one thing at a time. I think the first question is, who do you want to involve and which data will you be collecting? And then you can slowly take small steps from there on. I hope you can be a bit inspired by our data charter.
Great, yeah, there's definitely no shortage of inspiration in all of these resources. Yevgenia, your question.
Actually, first of all, I just want to say in front of everyone, thank you so much, Civil Belgium, for producing so much useful material and actually translating it for us so that not only the Belgians can benefit from it. This is amazing. I mean, I'm so happy we found you, to be honest, because it's so much, it's absolutely impossible to figure all these things out on our own. And I mean, just huge applause to you, really. So this is just to put it out there. And here is the challenge with the whole data thing, because the first question is, what kind of data are you going to collect? For my project, I don't know, because the approach I gonna try to do with our pilot in Norway is to actually, first of all, meet up with the citizens and let them define what our project is going to be about. So I don't want to predefine it. So I don't want to say that, okay, we're going to be measuring radon in houses, or our data collection will be, talking to people to see what kind of barriers for remediation they have, or, etc. So I want the people to be the ones defining. But does that mean I can't really think about data, all these other data issues before I start, or does it sort of still work if I don't know what kind of data I collect? Is it still, can I sort of skip that step in the beginning and then come back to it, or does it not make sense?
Yeah, so preparing for those unknowns, and yeah, as you're saying, Abhishek, it sounds like good co-design. It sounds like you're on the right path. But yeah, I can see it raises challenges. Ben and Annelies, any preferences as to who takes this one?
I think some principles you can already think about. How open do you want your project to be? You can maybe at a higher level already decide on some things, like whatever data will be collected. If it is collected by citizens, I want it to be open. You can maybe even already think about licenses. Of course, you can't really start drawing a data model or think about sensors and data platforms if you don't know what the data will be about. So I think it depends a bit, but it would be good to already check out what things you have to start thinking about once you know what the data will be.
Okay, thanks. That makes sense.
Yeah, I think my answer is basically the same as well. I'll just add that I'm actually really excited to hear that you're starting what sounds like a co-created project, and the data management process can be part of the co-creation. And this is surprisingly important because, sorry, I couldn't remember the name, but I know there were a couple of citizen science projects where, you know, the initiators, they had a good plan, right? But then when they worked with the citizen scientists, there were actually parts of the collected data that actually reveals information about where or how, you know, certain disadvantaged groups of people are, and those people are actually not necessarily comfortable with you know, revealing so much about themselves for fear of, you know, discrimination and those kind of things. So, but when you go through the co-creation process, then, you know, that's the opportunity to address problems like this. So actually, it's a good opportunity.
Thank you so much. I think you've actually, your point has suits so well to what we're doing. And there's one of the really important things we really need to consider, because we're going to be talking about the people's houses, and that's really sensitive, you know. So it might be really, you know, really private, and not everybody might be comfortable with sharing that they have high radon levels and want to or don't want to remediate. So that's definitely, perhaps for our project, is even more important to make the data management a part of the co-creation process, and rather decide on it with the citizens, but then just prepare, like, I'll need to put myself to go through it and prepare what are the different things to think of are. Thanks so much. This is super useful. Thank you.
Great, and we'll also have plenty of time to discuss the challenges in a bit more detail. I think it sounds like you have plenty of challenges in there to add to the brainstorm in just a moment that we can really take a bit further. So I'm looking forward to getting stuck into that too. One last question, anybody, before we move to the brainstorm? Anyone have a burning question? Otherwise, I wanted to hear from you, Ben, because since Anneliese's data chatter is broader than just open science, of course, open science is a key part of it, and making data findable and linkable, as she was saying, but it also covers data quality and ethics. And I wondered if you had any good examples to share on those points, any projects that you think are particularly worth looking at in terms of how well they've done on data quality, ethical aspects, anything you'd like to share on those?
Yeah, thank you. So I will try to draw from my experience in ecological research, and specifically for projects and citizen science projects that use camera traps, right, to get wildlife photos, because I think that touches on your questions. So number one, when it comes to data quality, I think it's a pretty big challenge for citizen science. A lot of data is collected in a really ad hoc and kind of informal way, and I think that's actually, and I also learned this from experience, because I have to admit, I didn't think I did it very well the first time I did my citizen science project. But looking back on it, I think rather than me as the project leader coming up with a data collection protocol for people to follow, this is actually another opportunity for co-creation, or maybe I can work with the citizen scientists to develop the data collection protocols that not only understandable for them, but actually works for them and benefits them as well in a way that they care about. So that's one way to deal with data quality. Again, you front load a lot of the work in the co-creation process. But I want to touch on the ethics side of it, because for camera traps, a big issue is privacy. And the privacy comes in two kind of forms, right? One is that scientifically, it's really important to record, where the camera trap was deployed and, when it was set up in that place. Now, some people set it up, in their backyards, in their homes. And of course, they might not be comfortable with sharing that information. So the compromise that we've come to is that for the data that we just publish out there, we kind of lower the resolution a little bit. So, okay, roughly it's in this, I don't know, like 2 square kilometer area or something like that, right? But it's not that we don't keep the high resolution data, because the data is valuable, but it's just a matter of how you share it, if that makes sense. Another really important thing when it comes to privacy are, sometimes people show up in these camera trap images. So the way we classify camera trap images is that we put all of it on our website, kind of like the Zooniverse. Everyone comes to the website and they help us classify the photos, but what if they see a person? So our compromise solution right now, and I'm happy to hear of a better way to do this, is if someone tags a photo as a human being is in this photo, then it's removed from the pool and we don't show it to other people anymore. After
one tag will remove it.
Yeah, exactly. Because for other photos of animals, we will actually ask a lot of people to tag it, right? So they're essentially voting on what animals isn't it. But for humans, first of all, humans are pretty easy to identify. So if one person says there's a human there, then there's probably a human there and we remove it. And of course, one last thing is that it's not only about humans, it's also about animals. Sometimes what if, a endangered species shows up? How do you deal with that? So in England, we have slightly less of a problem with that, but for projects in like different parts of Africa, that actually becomes a big problem. So the more important thing is, maybe they still publish the data, but they delay it by like 6 months or something. Because after 6 months, like the animal isn't going to be there anymore, right? So there are creative ways to get around this, to fulfill the responsibility of doing open science while addressing a lot of the privacy and ethical concerns. Sorry, that was a long answer to your question.
Brilliant. No, really useful to hear these kind of clever, innovative ideas, but which I'm sure were the result of a long process of sort of putting heads together and and this idea of co-creation behind a lot of these challenges. It's really, really nice to hear. Thank you so much, Pen and Annelies, for sharing in this discussion. We've covered a lot of challenges, but before we go for our break, I'd like to invite everybody to take a moment to share the challenges that you're facing when it comes to data